Expedition 44, welcome again here with your normal YouTube host, Matt and Ryan. We have a special guest today that we're very excited for, a little bit different than our normal theology, exegesis, not leaving any rock unturned, but very relevant to both our current series on the church and then just what we always do, which is trying to find the best view of analytical, logical truth in the way that we live. So, Matt, tell us a little bit about our guest today.
Hey, so I'm really excited to have Mike Gaddy on. I learned about Mike through our friend Craig over at the Bad Roman Project. If you haven't checked out his podcast, go do that. But I listened to an episode where he had Mike on to talk about the Constitution, and it just kind of blew my mind. And I'd heard of him before. I started binge listening to a whole bunch of stuff because I found that a lot of his views on history were stuff that I had found also. And he's a guy who's worked with source documents and all sorts of stuff. And so he's a walking history book is what Craig says. So we're really excited to have you on, Mike. Is there anything more you want to say about yourself to our audience, to introduce yourself?
Oh, that covers it for me, Matt. I'm more about the subject than I am about the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Well, Mike, I'm extremely excited to have you on today. A lot of our listeners know that before my theology days, I taught U.S. history for a number of years, both at the high school and community college level. And when I taught at the technical college, I was able to kind of creatively teach whatever I want. And one of the courses that I taught was U.S. history from a European perspective. And it was very different than what most kids, college students learn of our U.S. history. So that was the first time that my eyes were kind of open to seeing things a little bit differently. And today, when Matt and I are working through kind of no king but Christ thinking, we often hear people say things like, we need to return to our Christian values, or America was founded as a Christian country, and they think of our founding fathers as devout Christians of the faith and things like that. So where I would like you to start is talk about that notion. Is this true that the founding fathers sort of founded our country, our documents of origin, as if they were men of faith, or is there a different way to look at that?
Well, it brings to mind one of the things that I was taught very early on in my career in the oxymoronic field of government intelligence back in the late 60s. And that was, no matter how preposterous something sounds, if you receive a piece of intel, it is incumbent upon you to prove it wrong, to do whatever it takes. And if you can't prove it wrong, it's correct, which was a rather interesting approach for me as a young man. Let's take this piece of intel about X, Y, Z, and let's prove it to be false. I found it a very unique approach, and it's something I have endeavored to pursue throughout the past 40 years. And the first thing when I receive a question such as yours, sir, is to say, okay, well, let's look at Matthew 7:16. Where's the fruits? If these people were Christian, where's the fruits?
Yeah.
Now, there is a lot of mention of God. But who was their God? I think that is critical, because the one thing we do know, and this is something I have endeavored to go into quite a bit, is that, and you are a student of history as well. So the thing I think we have to understand is that, okay, all right, we're looking at this, we're asking a question. Were the founders Christians? Where's the proof? And one of the things I remember in reading thousands of source documents, especially when I was at the University of Virginia, their library was unreal at the Rotunda. The absolute plethora of original source documents was just, unreal. So I would go through those, and, how many people knows, and I think it's very critical for us who study history, because I've thought what it would be like today if you and I, sir, were to start studying modern history. What are our sources? Emails, text messages, all of this other stuff. Where are we going? How are we going to locate this and find it? In the days of the people that we call our founders, in the founding of America, there was one medium of exchange, and that was the letter. And how many people would be aware that in the Thomas Jefferson collection at the University of Virginia, that Jefferson wrote or received over 17,000 letters during his life?
Wow.
So, and then one of the things that intrigued me was the fact that he and James Monroe became so close during Jefferson's presidency that Jefferson and Monroe, who was a member of Congress at the time, actually put their letters in crypt because they were unaware of who was reading them. And then when you get into it, you find out the person they were most afraid of finding out what they were saying was Alexander Hamilton. So it was quite something to sit there and look at all of those letters. But there is where, to me, where history is to be found if we're going to look at that era. What did these people we call founders say to each other? And if you go back and look at their letters, there was only one person that I can find that espoused Christian values, and that was Patrick Henry. When we look at Jefferson, Jefferson had his own Bible where he removed everything that Christ said.
Yep.
he didn't want that in there. And in one of his last letters to his compatriot, which I think is interesting for those who are really interested in history, is to look at the final years of correspondence between Jefferson and John Adams, who had a tremendous falling out in 1800 because of the election.
Yeah.
And so there was this falling out. And then after Jefferson's presidency, they began to communicate again. And that began with, Abigail Adams' letter to Jefferson, a letter of condolences because of the loss of his daughter. And so then their communication begins again. Well, one of the very last letters, and they both died on the same day. Actually, Jefferson passed away in the morning. Adams passed away in the afternoon, but John Adams' last words were, "Jefferson lives." Of course, we didn't have CNN, so he didn't know he was dead. But the point, one of the letters that Jefferson sent, one of his very last communications with John Adams was, I only wish that I would have lived long enough to have seen every American a Unitarian. So to me, a man at near the end of his life, and that's his position, he did not embrace Christianity.
Right.
Yep.
So, as much as we all would like to believe that Jefferson did, but, we can also, and pardon me for jumping around a bit, but we can go back to 1784 in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, where they were talking about the issues in Virginia at the time, which was the separation of church and state. And there was a huge discussion going on then about it. And in that letter in 1784, Thomas Jefferson writes to, and of course, Patrick Henry was pushing the Christian faith. He wanted the Christian faith to be a part of their government in Virginia. And in the letter from Jefferson to Madison, Jefferson says, we should pray fervently for the death of Patrick Henry.
Wow.
Does that sound like a Christian to you?
Well, I know some Christians that say things like that. So yeah.
Well, can you? Here's a question, tough question, but can you really, truly be a Christian and harbor that kind of sentiment?
Right.
Yep. It's nothing like Christ.
So I think, and most people, and like I said, Matthew 7:16, where's the fruits? All right, we know unequivocally that in 1787 we had a constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation.
Yep.
And the Articles of Confederation says it's perpetual. Okay, Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation says nothing can be done without the consent of all of the states. So that is true consent of the governed. Everyone has to agree, not a majority, not 3/4, not, but everyone has to agree. So that was a huge handicap for the Federalists, who I really believe were, in fact, monarchists. And that was a problem for them. And so they needed to circumvent Article 13 but the point of it is none of them had been given the authority to do so. All of the state legislatures sent their delegates to Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation. No one had the authority to create a new constitution. So let's look at it in modern day terms. If you selected a group of people to go do something that is vital to your own interest and the interest of others, and you give them the authority to do so, and the first thing they do is to do what they want to do and ignore everything which they are obligated to do. Is that Christian?
Nope.
Sure doesn't sound like it.
And if we look at number one, in Luther Martin, and most people have never heard of Luther Martin. Put Luther Martin into a Google or any other search engine, and they will correct you immediately and say you mean Martin Luther. No, I don't mean Martin Luther. I mean Luther Martin. And most people have never heard of him. And Luther Martin is probably one of the most intriguing people of the founding era to me. The longest sitting attorney general in the history of the United States, state attorney general. And he was an attorney general for the state of Maryland for over 30 years and was just absolutely brilliant. Probably the greatest legal mind in American early history. And he absolutely detested Thomas Jefferson. He but at the Constitutional Convention, because he was handling a case for Maryland, the state of Maryland, which was his duty, he arrived at the Constitutional Convention 2 weeks late.
Yeah.
So
and he was friends with, is he the guy that was friends with Patrick Henry as an anti-federalist?
Actually, I wouldn't call them friends.
Okay.
They were on the same page,
okay.
But I don't think I can find no friendship whatsoever between them. Now, he was very close with Aaron Burr.
Okay.
Extremely close with Burr. As a matter of fact, after he had his fatal stroke in 1819, Aaron Burr actually moved him in with him to care for him until his death in New York.
Yeah, he died in Burr's home, right?
Right. That is correct. So here is, Luther Martin, and the first thing he does is, and he was chastised later, because here's another thing for people to think about. When have you ever seen a group of, let's just say, 55 Christians get together to work on something for the masses? Not only for themselves, but for everyone and their posterity. Now, how many of those 55, and being Christians, what would we say a common denominator with? Embarking on such a gigantic feature, do you think no one would say, well, hey, we might ought to pray over this?
Yeah.
Right.
Didn't happen. Didn't happen. So how many times, and just think of our own recollection. Let's think of 55 Christians that we know, maybe down at the church, maybe our closest friends, maybe whoever. Have you ever sat down with them and started thinking about something of an enormous magnitude that someone didn't say, well, we ought to kick this off with prayer?
Mm-hmm. Well, they were all lawyers. How many lawyers do you know that start things out with prayer?
Zero. There was see, this is thanks for that point. This is one of the things that most people don't understand. And that is in 1787, the percentage of lawyers in the population was 0.06%.
Is that we the people? Are we talking about we the people now?
Well, that gets to be fun because that's Gouverneur Morris's bastard stepchild, we the people. But anyway, it gets to be rather ironic, as we look at all of this and we look the fact that we know that the Quakers, through Trench Cox, in a letter which was given to Benjamin Franklin to read at the Constitutional Convention, the Quakers wanted the abolition of slavery. They did not want slavery included in this new Constitution or in the amendments to the Constitution. They wanted to do away with slavery totally.
Mm-hmm.
Benjamin Franklin chose not to read that letter at the convention. But what letter did he choose to read?
Was it Himes' letter?
Well, it probably came from Haym Solomon, but it was a letter from Jonas Phillips of the Philadelphia synagogue. And what they asked for was, let's do away with any Christian oath in any instance because it excludes Jews from participation. Okay, well, all right. Well, they read that one, but they won't read the one about slavery.
Right.
That sounds like a Christian to you guys?
Not really.
So, and here was one of the questions, and I remember asking this question when I was in college, and I asked this question, and I kind of erupted the classroom. I said, well, as I read these official documents, the founders themselves, the people we call founders, mention Patrick Henry as the most vibrant Christian among the entire colonies. Here's the guy, the most devout Christian there is, and he says, no, I ain't going to that convention. I smell a rat. Well, I said, if the Constitution was inspired by God, did Patrick Henry not get the memo?
Right.
Yeah.
My favorite thing there is when the Quakers begged the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention to exempt them from tax. So Matt and I refer to that like if our kingdom is Christ's kingdom and we're not necessarily in this American one, shouldn't we be tax free? And that kind of starts getting into all of these conversations on taxation and everything else.
Oh, for sure. And taxation was a huge part of this. The Federalist monarchist founders, as I call them, had to have a constitution that would allow them unlimited taxation from unlimited sources for any reason they chose.
Yeah.
And the primary reason for that, which most people don't understand, is the fact at the Constitutional Convention, there were at least 7 people there at the convention that owed the United States government vast amounts of money.
Right.
Including Robert Morris, who owed him about 17 mil.
Yeah.
Yep.
So then we look at that, and then we know that we have the projection of, okay, well, let's do this, let's do that, let's look at this, let's look at that. And none of it, when I go back to Matthew 7:16, none of this shows me the fruits of a Christian.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see them. If the Constitution was inspired by God, really? Well, why did they exclude any oath? Well, of course, inspired by God. Let's go back. Who's God?
Yep.
And I think that's critical. But I would like to touch more on your point, sir, about lawyers. Out of the 55 attendees to the Constitutional Convention, 34 of them were attorneys.
Wow.
Now, that's a little bit more than 0.06%, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that whole representation thing gets a little skewed.
Oh, very much so. And then there's so many instances of this. Let's go to and I'm jumping forward here. Kick me back if I need to be back. But let's look at the over 200 proposed amendments to the Constitution by the states. And once they got to the first Congress, James Madison appoints a committee of 5 to go through those 200 and to throw out the ones that might really restrict government.
Yeah.
And those 5 committee members were all lawyers.
And wasn't the Constitution passed with no Bill of Rights?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And not only that, but a Bill of Rights was voted down unanimously at the convention.
Yeah, so much for we the people.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and that, but here I'm jumping the creek again, but here's the thing. Let's stop and look at that preamble. The preamble was written and entirely transposed, totally different from the one that had been issued by the Committee of Style. The Committee of the Whole. The Committee of Style and Arrangement, led by Gouverneur Morris, completely changed the preamble of the Constitution. And it's important, I think, that we look at that and understand it for what it is. And it starts off with, we, the people of the United States, in order to form more perfect union, establish justice, provide for the, blah, 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 blah. Do hereby ordain and establish this Constitution for the people of the United States of America. 2 separate legal entities. And I don't think most people catch on to that. But let's go back to a little later, after the government had some years to operate. 28 USC 3002-15A states that the United States is a corporation. So a corporation established this Constitution for the people of the United States of America, with the corporation reigning supreme. And then later, the Supreme Court would say that a corporation has all the rights of an individual. So, it's a morass in so many ways to look at, because there's so many different facets of this that I don't think most Americans have ever even been subjected to.
Yeah.
Yep.
I've heard people kind of say, there was necessarily not much, if any, prayer at that constitutional convention. And then Franklin kind of has this motion, to implement prayer, which I'd love you to address a little bit on your thoughts. But you hear people kind of talk about that as like a miraculous breakthrough that, all of a sudden it becomes a God-blessed Constitution. Give us a little light on that.
Well, here's my first question. What group of people has to have a member of the Hellfire Club to bring up prayer?
Right. Are those Christians? Yeah.
Yeah. And see, that's something I think most people are unaware of. And this really surprised me when I got into this, because what prompted Franklin to bring up prayer?
Oh, it's bizarre to me. Yeah. This is a great conversation.
Well, we're in the middle of late July here, and it is one of the hottest summers on record in Philadelphia. Well, the convention is meeting in secret. They have armed guards at the doors. All
Christian over the windows, probably. Yeah.
Yes. So it's got to be hot in that place. And so tempers are going to flare. And there was, under some objections to slavery and to some other issues, and especially representation by population, which was strongly contested by Luther Martin, it ends up being a screaming match. With obscenities being thrown at Luther Martin and other stuff. And that is best I can tell from what I can read from from Madison and from Robert Yates and from also Luther Martin and his Genuine Information, and Francis Mercer, what his notes. From the best I can read, the best I can discern, this is what prompted Franklin, because here we have a group of people, it's about to fall apart, and they're screaming and yelling at each other about representation and about slavery. And so suddenly Franklin makes a motion, said, I think we ought to begin every day with prayer, just like we did in the First Continental Congress.
Didn't Alexander Hamilton object?
Well, he gets a second.
Okay.
He did get the second, but then Hamilton jumps in and says, no, we can't do this, because if we resort to prayer, we're telling the people on the outside there's problems here.
Didn't he say something about like they shouldn't bring in a higher power?
Well, that is not totally confirmed. I have seen 3 references to that, but nothing hard evidence.
Okay.
So I always try to stipulate that, but it was stipulated by at least 3 members, including John Francis Mercer, that Hamilton said, I do not wish to submit these proceedings to another power, a foreign power. Well, if it's a Christian get together, what's the foreign power he doesn't want it submitted to?
Yep.
So, and what would you, as a Christian gentleman, and you heard that there was a group of politicians getting together trying to decide something so paramount in your future, would you be concerned if they decided to resort to prayer?
No.
Well, why was
I think
Hamilton?
It's great that they call it a foreign power, though. That feeds Matt and I's argument pretty well that we're just ambassadors passing through here.
Exactly, and then in Franklin's biography, he so stipulates, and I have the book sitting right beside me here, an 1836 version, and here is Franklin stipulating that, okay, to my knowledge, only maybe 2 or 3 of all of the delegates to the convention thought prayers were ever necessary.
Wow.
Does that sound like 55 Christians to you?
Nope.
So, it's so interesting. And, I remember my grandfather lived to be 100. He was probably the wisest man I've ever met, with a second-grade education. But he would lead me sometimes into some real thoughts about these things from his perspective. And I'll never forget, and I hope you gentlemen will pardon my phraseology here, but I'm going to quote him directly. I remember sitting down with him in his late 90s, and he was talking to me about what my research was and what I was doing at the archives and at the Library of Congress, University of Virginia, University of Maryland, all of those places I was working. And he asked me, exactly what are you getting involved in here? And I said, Paul, I really can't understand why, regardless of how much hard, concrete evidence you have about the Constitutional Convention and about the founders, as we call them, or the framers, as we call them, the thing that really concerns me is that, people just, okay, all right. I said, it's not what we were taught. And I said, when I bring the concrete information to groups and to people, they do not want to believe it. And they run away like their hair's on fire. And I'll never forget his comment. And he had this way, everything was very concise in his world. There was no gray. It was black or white. And I'll never forget him looking straight at me, and he said, boy, ain't nobody wants to believe that their mama's a whore.
Yeah.
And I realize that's a rather crass definition, but is that not a fit analogy when it comes to people in the Constitution?
Yeah.
Yep.
So
go ahead, Matt.
Sorry. I was going to ask, since we're talking a bit about the Constitution, how is the Bible represented kind of in the proceedings? Was it brought up at all? And how did they, were there, what were some, maybe the popular verses that might've been thrown out and in the finishing and the conversations around the convention and that?
Well, Matt, I can't find in any of the documents available that the Bible was mentioned at the convention.
Wow.
I can't find anything about that at all. And it's rather startling, but one of the things I did, and I would recommend this to you gentlemen, and if you haven't already read it, I'll be happy to get you a PDF version. But there was a study that I found 40 years ago, and it's just absolutely fantastic. And the title of the study was Excerpts from the Sermons in the Churches During the Revolutionary Era.
Wow.
Now, I thought, when I first saw that, I thought, what a source. If I want to know what the people are thinking, let's go see what was being talked about in church. What were they talking about? What was important to them? And to me, that is something I think we overlook. But as I went through and started counting out the number of particular Bible passages that were mentioned by the ministers, the most popular and the most frequent passage from the Bible was Galatians 5:1. And it was repeated many times in not only from the Anglican church, but the other churches, the ministers. It was repeated over and over, Galatians 5:1. So the Bible was mentioned by the people. The Bible was not mentioned by the founders.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So, there's kind of two takes on this, and I think that most people believe that the Constitution is Christian or biblical, and when you get into it, I would say that it makes no reference to God, Christ, Christianity, or the Bible at all. There's no religious purposes anywhere in it from my perspective, but some would say that when you get into like Romans 8 and 13, that the framework of the Constitution would be put forth so that if somebody wanted to, observe a Christian government, that we could eventually get there. I struggle with that notion.
Oh, well, if you want something, if you want to go out and buy yourself a new truck, do you go out and buy 4 tires and set them in the yard and wait for the rest of it? Or do you get the whole thing? Do you not want it from the very beginning? Do you not want what you actually want? If you actually wanted a biblical constitution, why would you not insist on that?
Well, unless you're Johnny Cash and you're stealing one part at a time, it doesn't make much sense.
That is true. That is true. Very much so. It's such an interesting subject, guys, and you have no idea. In my pursuits and stuff, people want, like last night, I had a 2-hour live class on Telegram, and we talked about the letters between Agnes Burke and Samuel Bryant, and their in-depth study of what actually happened during the Constitution and its ratification. And we got into it last night, and I told them we're probably going to need 3 weeks on this. Yeah. But there is no mention. There is no biblical mention. The only thing, when you stop and look at it, I actually had some of these hard-headed folks in Texas and some kind of organization they've got down there who really got after me a few years ago, and they said, you can't say that the Constitution is not a Christian document because, by golly, right at the bottom it says in the year of our Lord. Say what? That's your only reference to God, and you think it's a Christian document? Are you gentlemen familiar with Samuel Bryan at all?
That's Sentinel?
Yes, that's Sentinel.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, he made, and I think it was in his Sentinel number 6, he made an interesting observation. He said he thought that to ensure its acceptance, that the founders themselves would wrap the Constitution in the cloaks of divinity. Which makes me think of something on a rather different level. If I can find it here, gentlemen, I will bring it up. I think it's quite relevant. Do you mind if I read this? It's not that long.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, quote, Christianity has often been allied with civil government. Since the 3rd century of the Christian era, such a connection was made. Such a theory was induced in part by the fact that under the Old Covenant, a theocracy existed, and the civil government was instituted to a large degree to maintain and foster religion. Civil rulers, for the purposes of self-aggrandizement, subordinated Christianity, or rather ecclesiastical organizations, to their corrupt purposes. When church and state are united, the state practically assumes infallibility and the right to sit in judgment upon all creeds and to determine what is and what is not a church, what is true and what is a false in religion, unquote. Wow. So that, I can see, just imagine, if you're a politician, you would want all of the people to think everything you were doing was inspired by God, right?
Yep.
So why not project that? And again, for Samuel Bryan to bring that up, that, they will cloak it in the, they will cloak it in the robes of divinity, I think was probably just an absolute astounding and astute observation at that period of time.
Mm-hmm. So was there any other Christian pushback to the Constitution? I know that you mentioned Patrick Henry. What were maybe some of his reasons?
Well, if you look at, the ratification convention in Virginia lasted for 23 days. Patrick Henry spoke on 17 of those 23 days. Right near the end of, and this to me is where he is really astounding. This is where he got his moniker, the Voice of Thunder. So here he is, and he realizes he has to make a last-ditch approach to stop ratification of the Constitution. So he does a 7-hour presentation.
Wow.
With passion. I'm talking, when you read this, I get cold chills every time I read it. Here's a man who is firmly convinced of what he's doing, and he realizes he has to stop this Constitution. Well, when he gets, and he had the ability, when you read about him, if you study Patrick Henry, which I have for the better part of 50 years, and there are some anomalies about the man, especially toward the end of his life, but there are some things that were just unreal. His passion was unmatched. What better can we say than give me liberty or give me death? And so he goes into these speeches and these presentations, but on right near the end of the convention, he is very passionate. He could really get into it. So many people spoke of this, even Jefferson. Jefferson said Patrick Henry speaks as Homer writes. So he was enthralled with, and of course, the two met as teenagers. Well, Jefferson was a teenager. Patrick Henry was in his 20s when they first met at a Christmas party. I think it was 1759. But anyway, you look at what Patrick Henry had to say, he got so passionate. He could just move people with his passion in his presentations. He didn't write much, but the oratory was off the charts. So here he is. I forgot exactly what day it was in June. But anyway, he's into this fiery presentation opposing the Constitution. July, Virginia, thunderstorm. Boom. Lightning hits the ground right outside of the convention center. And it just shocks the people inside. Patrick Henry doesn't miss a beat. He continues with his fiery oratory. A few minutes later, boom, lightning hits in outside the place again, the convention center. Everyone in the convention center jumps and flees. They left the building. The next day, Edmund Randolph accused Patrick Henry of calling down demonic spirits on the convention.
Wow.
Wow.
So this leads me to my next point.
All right.
Was the convention even legal? Like,
No.
why did we even need the convention? Didn't we already have, articles of confederation or whatever else we needed? I mean, it's been kind of called a runaway convention at different points, and you kind of hear Madison and Hamilton's kind of takeover, so to speak. I mean, there are many that would propose that it wasn't even legal in the way that it happened. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it absolutely was illegal because the law of the day was the Articles of Confederation. And as soon as the convention got together in May, and as soon as 7 states arrived, Madison, Hamilton, and others took over, made Washington the president of the convention for acceptability purposes. Washington was a mediocre individual at best. I mean, you really get into him. He was mediocre on the field of battle. He wrote a letter to John Jay before the convention started and said, I think what we're about to do here is illegal, but let's do it anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a Christian?
Right.
Hey, guys, I think what we're about to do here may be against the law, but heck, let's do it.
Cover the windows, put some armed guards up, we're good to go.
Yeah.
And don't talk about it for 50 years.
Yeah, and nobody can say anything about it for 50 years.
Yep.
Well, see, as I mentioned before, that's where Luther Martin got by because he wasn't there for that part. And so when he starts talking about what's going on at the convention to the people back in Maryland, boy, the Federalists get really angry at him. Mm-hmm. Look, this is a secret. You're not supposed to be talking about this. And he said, I loved his comment. He said, are you trying to tell me that all of the intelligence of 300 million people is centered in this room?
Right.
Why can't I speak with other people about these issues? It will affect them. So he caught the Dickens for actually going to the Maryland legislature and telling them what was going on. But here was your point about, was it legal? The Articles of Confederation were in place. And it says that they were there in perpetuity. So in late May, when 7 state delegates from 7 states get there, they convene the convention. And they say all it will take is any 4 states out of 7 to create policy. Well, 4 out of 13, help me out here, guys. Yeah. Luther Martin got all over that. Luther Martin said, no, you can't do that. And then Luther Martin brought up to them, the day that you convened the convention without every state present, you violated Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation. Therefore, anything that proceeds from this cannot be fruitful.
And I think Rhode Island didn't even attend, right?
Yeah,
didn't
right.
they?
Exactly.
Didn't they say they weren't going? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They did not attend. So, and New Hampshire didn't get there for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And by the time,
where was Thomas Jefferson, which is interesting, and John Adams and some other ones?
Well, Jefferson was in France and Adams was in England.
Okay.
So they did not even attend.
And you had Samuel Adams and Hancock, I think, were a couple of the other ones?
Nope, they were not invited. And Hancock gets to be an interesting story because the Federalists bought him. They bribed him to support ratification of the Constitution. They went to John Hancock and they told him, said, look, if Washington refuses to be president, we want you to be president. And if Washington accepts it, we're going to make you vice president as long as you will push for ratification in Massachusetts. So Hancock does, Washington accepts, they throw him under the bus. Okay,
Yeah.
we used you, we got what we wanted from you. So, there it is. So, here's the thing, no matter how many years pass us by, guys, the nature of man never changes.
Right.
Yep.
So, yes, to speak to that, the entire convention was a criminal act. Samuel Adams, pardon me, Samuel Bryan called it a criminal conspiracy from the very beginning. And it was criminal in the fact that they were not going by the law of the day, which was the Articles of Confederation. So how, let's go back to Matthew 7:16. Where's the fruits?
Yeah.
Can you violate the law of the land and create a document that will protect the law of the land at the same time?
So just coming back to where we started this conversation, you hear a lot of times that America was founded on Christian principles and all of this, yet when we talk to you and we hear about all of this stuff, I mean, it sounds not only not Christian, but to me, it almost sounds the opposite of Christian. Secret conventions and, non-Christians and all these things that were happening, that when we read, what does a Christian look like? What does Jesus look like in the Bible? What you're telling us is actually sounds like a recipe for everything the Bible kind of says don't do.
Well, I think that is a valid observation. It's been my observation for the last 40 years. I don't see, that old thing about how can you have good fruit from a poisonous tree?
Yeah.
Yep.
And here's the thing, another thing that needs to be mentioned that I don't think most people are aware of. In the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, there was submitted to them a list of amendments to consider to the articles. And the Congress at that time was controlled by Federalists, but including Hamilton.
Yeah.
But they knew that because of those term limits in the Articles of Confederation, they were about to be voted out.
Yep.
They knew it was coming. So they needed to move quickly to make sure they got this Constitution to get out from under the controls of the Articles of Confederation. So they made that move as quickly as they could, but they were submitted amendments to the Articles in the sitting Congress, and they refused to debate them. They refused to discuss them. They decided instead, we don't want to discuss this under the Articles of Confederation. We want to create a new Constitution. And here's the point, gentlemen, that I ask people today. Would you in a heartbeat accept similar circumstances today? What if we got 55 guys together, 34 of them were prominent lawyers, the others were bankers and politicians? Would you allow them to go into a secret enclave for 3 months and come up with a new form of government?
Nope.
Would you say, oh, well, we got to let them do it, guys. They're inspired by God? Would we accept it? I don't think there's any way.
No.
So why would we accept something because it's 234 years old that we wouldn't accept today?
So being that this sounds very unchristian to me, I mean, if this were going on, like you just said, if this was happening right now, would Matt and I be, on board with this? No, we'd be the one saying this doesn't sound like, Christians should be involved with this. So back then, was there any Christian pushback to that when it was happening?
Oh, yeah. That is the point. And that was, I think is so valid. Is that if we had a constitutional convention today, like 1787, every Christian I know would oppose it.
Yeah.
So how can we wrap our arms around this because someone told us this was, and I'll never forget one of my closest friends. He was the son of a gentleman that is probably about, one of the best ministers I've ever met in my life. And we called him the cowboy preacher out in Colorado. And his son, one time we were talking in a conversation in one of my classes. And I said, how many of you people, and this is 15 years ago, I said, how many of you people believe the Constitution was inspired by God? And his son raises his hand. Of course, he's a young adult by then. He raises his hand. And he said, I do. It is. And I said, pardon me, Michael, but where's your proof? Mm-hmm. If it was inspired by God, show me the proof. If you can show me the proof, I'll be on your side. But I'm not going to accept the words because somebody wrote them on a piece of paper. And we have to understand, again, and we're jumping a whole new creature here, but we have to understand in 1906, 1907, 3 nonprofit organizations took over the education system of this country. And they perverted the dickens out of it. And they actually paid, and they're still doing it. They pay college professors with that PhD after their name to write books of revisionist history that are so far from the truth, it's incredible. Eric Foner is a prime example, an admitted Marxist. And he's considered to be a historical authority? Please? When I look back at someone asked me recently in one of my classes, who was one of the last authors who wrote about the constitutional era who was honest? And I said,
that's a great question.
I said, without a doubt, in my mind, it had to be Merrill Jensen. Merrill Jensen wrote through the early 1950s, was very prominent in the 30s and 40s. And I know you guys would appreciate him. A lot of people find him hard to read because if you start reading his work, you open a page and there's a paragraph and then there's the rest of the page is all footnotes. Merrill Jensen footnoted everything he said to source documents. I mean, he didn't want anyone accepting his opinion. He's been my role model for quite some time. He did not want it whatsoever, but he gave just to give you an example, he gave a lecture at the University of the Pacific. I think it had a different name back then, in 1937. And he gave a lecture titled The Articles of Confederation Revisited. Try to find that. Try to find what he said. And then let's also remember that for over 100 years, the anti-federalists were never mentioned by American historians.
Yeah.
100 years. Why? You can't tell me, you yourself are a historian, sir. Do you discount anybody? Do you not have to look at what everybody has to say to form a composite of the truth?
Yeah.
If you eliminate people for whatever reason, that, especially when it's by design, like the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto American Public Fool System has done, there's a reason they got rid of history too. Mm-hmm. I asked my grandson, 11-year-old grandson, the other day, I said, well, what did you study in history today? And he said, we don't have history, Grandpa. I said, you don't have history in school? He said, no, we have social studies. Right. I said, what do you study? Facebook? That's social. And of course, my daughter told me a couple of times, please don't tell him too much because every time he talks to you, he gets in trouble at school. So it was kind of a...
My daughter has the same problem when I talk about history with them.
Yeah.
It is pretty crazy to look at, just under the Articles of Confederation that Congress had no power to levy taxes. I mean, what would it be like if we were just still under the Articles of Confederation?
Well, the point of it is that and Patrick Henry got into this in detail at the Virginia Ratification Convention. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress could ask the states for money, requisition money from the states. And the states, in many instances, complied. In several other instances, they didn't. I mean, if we go back and look, 1785 gets here, the war's over. There were some states that had never contributed a penny. Well, that was an issue, I think, that has to be addressed, that we should look at. But it was apportioned by population, how much taxes they had to pay. Well, then we end up with the Constitution. And here's another thing most people don't think about. Those states which had paid all of their debts, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia, had paid off all of their debts under the Constitution. Now they're being taxed to pay off the debt again. You think there might have been some issues there when the other states hadn't paid anything? But Patrick Henry said, look, here we cannot ever allow taxation to be on an individual basis. Yeah. And he made a very relevant point. He said, if the government needs more money than it can get from imposts, from commerce, which allows the person to choose what tax they pay. You can say, okay, I want that Volkswagen and I have to pay $10 tax, or I can get that huge Rolls Royce and I have to pay $300 tax. The choice is yours. Patrick Henry spoke to that extensively about people choosing how much tax they wanted to pay. But he made a very relevant point at the Virginia Ratification Convention. He said, we cannot allow the central government to be able to tax the people on an individual basis. Because if the states say, no, I ain't giving you money for that, they can't put the state in jail. But if an individual says, no, I am not giving you money to do what I consider to be morally reprehensible, they can put you in jail.
Good point.
So I thought that was for Patrick Henry to make that point back then, and that's something we don't talk about. We don't talk about the validity of that statement. And of course, Patrick Henry in his wisdom said, that the necessary and proper clause, the commerce clause, and the general welfare clause will be the windows through which all manners of evil shall pass.
Yep.
And he nailed that one. So, we think about those things, and but guys, I can't understand how an intelligent person can actually look at the facts, and I think that's what we have to do, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at the facts of a situation, let's consider ourselves, Dr. Ryan, I don't know what you consider yourself, but I call myself a forensic historian.
Okay.
Let's take this thing apart. Let's look at it. Let's do an autopsy. I don't see how anyone can look at the facts of the convention and still claim it was a Christian event, because they did away with oaths to the Christian faith.
That's right, they did. Yeah, didn't almost all the states had Christian oaths in their
except Rhode Island.
Except for Rhode Island, that's right.
Right. All 12 of them had an oath to the Christian faith. Now, Article 6, Clause 3 did something. It not only said that you cannot serve in the, you do not have to take an oath to the Christian faith to serve in the central government. You do not have to take an oath to the Christian faith to serve in the state governments. How could a new constitution that had no bearing suddenly start telling the states what they could and could not do? Mm-hmm. And why was it so important to get rid of the Christian faith? Was it just because the synagogue of Philadelphia asked you to? Was that the reason? Why did they decide to eliminate the Christian faith? That is something I can't find an answer to. The only answer I've been able to find is Jonas Phillips' letter asking them to do away with the oath to the Christian faith, because Jews, and therefore Jews were eliminated from public service. as they called it.
So Matt's a pastor. We have several friends of our channel that are pastors, and I often think if this were happening today, what would the pastors think of it? As I alluded to, Matt and I wouldn't have anything to do with this if it was going on today. In fact, I would probably be one of them vehemently speaking against it, probably. But back in the day, is there any kind of recollection of what the pastors thought of the Constitutional Convention, or where our nation was headed?
Well, one of the most interesting things is when Agnes Burke, and he also is not heard of very much, but when Agnes Burke asked that exact question, and what he did was he sent out a questionnaire to Samuel Bryan and to Elbridge Gerry after the Constitution was ratified. And he sent it out and he said, how did this happen? How did we get this Constitution? How did we get this whole thing? How did we get this? Mm-hmm. And he asked some very relevant questions. I got to give Agnes Burke a lot of credit because he knew what happened in Charleston, South Carolina. But he did not know what happened in Philadelphia. He did not know what happened in Boston. So he sent out a letter to those two gentlemen with 30 questions to help explain how this all came about. Well, ironically, Elbridge Gerry did not answer, but Samuel Bryan did very extensively. Gave an extensive report from his view from Philadelphia. And, which is something I think is critical because, if we were to select representation from your home state for a constitutional convention, would you be okay if all of the members of the delegation were from the same city?
Yeah, that gets back to that we the people conversation again.
It does, exactly. All eight of the delegates from Philadelphia from Pennsylvania were from Philadelphia. So, and I'm trying to get to the point here is the question that Agnes Burke asked, which I think is very relevant. And he asked it to Elbridge Gerry and to Samuel Bryan. He said, did the people actually know what was happening? Did the average person even know because it was in secret? Did the average person even know there was a convention?
And wasn't he the one that made some kind of quote like 4 out of 5 people detest what's going on or something like that?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Burke is an interesting character. That's why we don't study him in history.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, that is a question that I have pursued for the better part of a decade, is what did the people like Matt or you, Dr. Ryan, or me or anyone else, what did they know from May to September? Did they even know it was going on, or were those farmers out there in western Pennsylvania, western Tennessee, the other places, western Georgia, which was Mississippi and Alabama, and Kentucky, and all of these places, did they even know there was a convention going on?
Doesn't seem likely.
Well, we've gone into the records, and it shows that even the Postmaster General of the United States would not allow anti-federalist writings to be distributed.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a very interesting subject, guys. And, I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you two gentlemen. I don't get an opportunity like this that often.
Yeah, well, we've loved having you on. The other thing that I was thinking of, you talked about the Federalists and the anti-Federalists, and you mentioned earlier that the Federalists, you call them also monarchists. So how do you make that connection? we kind of also get, we have a friend who is like, well, we often use the no king but Christ language, and they say, well,
Right.
we don't have kings in America, we have representatives. Yet the Federalists very much seemed like wanted a monarchy.
Oh, absolutely. They even said so. If you go to June the 18th in 1787, Alexander Hamilton finally got tired of all of the talk about representation and all the other stuff. He actually stood up and proposed a full-on monarchy, to which James Madison said, oh, Hamilton let the cat out of the bag. And then he and James Wilson moved quickly to try to smooth it over. But and John Francis Mercer wrote a letter to Luther Martin, his fellow delegate from Maryland. After they both left in late August of 1787, he sent a letter to Luther Martin citing the 20 delegates that had, in fact, at the convention actually told him they wanted a monarchy.
Wow.
And then let's look at what Patrick Henry said at the Virginia Ratification Convention. Quote, away with your president. We shall have a king, unquote.
Yeah.
I was a young history teacher right out of college. I took a job at 21 years old teaching high school history, and I came in halfway through the year taking over for a history teacher, and they were right in the middle of the Federalist Papers, going through reading the Federalist Papers, writing reports of them. And my first question was, has anybody read the Anti-Federalist Papers? And out of this class of 22 juniors and seniors, none of them even realized that there were Anti-Federalist Papers at all.
Well, that 100-year ban worked, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
So they weren't mentioned. So if you don't want anyone to hear opposition, I don't know about you gentlemen, but if I'm proposing something, I want to hear, I'll lay it out. I want to hear your opposition.
Matt and I always say, when you look at our theology bookshelves, we have as many theology books about what we don't believe as we do about what we believe.
Don't you have to?
Yeah.
Yeah. You
Use
should.
all the evidence to make an informed decision.
Yes, you have to, it's like, could I say, use the phrase, we are actually juries, members of a jury, and we have to listen to all of the evidence before we make a decision. People who make a decision, I've made this equivocation, not equivocation, but an analogy of, okay, we're having a court session on, was the Constitution legal? All right, anyone who says it wasn't will not be allowed to testify.
Right.
That
is a great point, though.
Well, my grandfather taught me, he said there are two systems when you think through something. He says there is the intelligent. He says there is where you examine every little element. And he said, I sometimes refer to that as the keep it simple movement. He said, now our opponents go under the swag method, which is a scientific wild ass guess. And, when you talk with people, how many people do you see who may have read, and this is one of the things that I put on Facebook the other day. I said, isn't it amazing that a person can do 40 years of research and a person who read something on Google is now the expert?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. So,
and I don't know. Go ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, if you had something, you could keep going. I was gonna say, we want to respect your time, so I had one more question for you, and it's a practical one. I'm a pastor, so I want to get down to how do we, what should we do type stuff.
Put them on the hot seat, Matt.
Yeah. So this might be more of what your opinion is. I know you've given a lot of historical evidence, but
and we get that you don't like to give your opinion. You just want to give the material and let people make their own. But we're asking for you to go out a little bit on a limb here and help us out.
Yeah. So
for you gentlemen, I'll do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about government, a lot about the quote unquote Christian foundation of America. So should Christians today be involved in government offices? Is there a place for God in the government?
Should Christians be involved in the drug trade?
Yeah. Or the mafia.
Or should Christians be involved in any of the local criminal activities, anything that you want to do, whether it would be, and I know I catch a lot of the dickens over this, but I do not believe that the government has the right to tell us what we can and what we cannot put in our bodies.
Yep.
Because Thomas Jefferson said, if you do not own yourself, you will never be free.
Yep.
And we have, and here was a question. I have a very good friend who's a retired sheriff in Colorado. He was head of the drug squad for about 11 years before he was elected president. And I asked him one time, I said, Dennis, we keep spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on drug enforcement, but we keep having more and more and more problems with drugs. And I said, what amount of money would it take to stop the drug business from a law enforcement point of view? And he said, Mike, there ain't enough money in the world. He said, you can't stop this because we're dealing with human beings and their very nature. He said, we have laws against murder. Do we have murders? Yes. Do we have laws against theft? Yes. Do we have theft? So he said, the only thing that I have seen, and I always gave him a lot of credit. He told me one of the funniest stories that I've ever heard as a law enforcement officer. Of course, he had a great sense of humor. But I asked him one time, I said, Dennis, you've been in law enforcement for 30 years. Have you ever met a violent person on marijuana? And he said, no. Wait. There was that time I got between a guy and these Cheetos. So, and I know that I've seen the effects that it had. But gentlemen, I also remember as a combat infantryman in Vietnam in 1967 being issued drugs to keep me awake. Biphetamine T20s, Black Beauties, all of these things that were just handed out to us. Okay, this will help you stay awake. You won't fall asleep on patrol. No matter how long you're up here, let's give you these drugs. So the government is handing out drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
And without a doubt, gentlemen, I will tell you from my oxymoronic career in government intelligence and from my military career, the largest drug dealer on the planet is the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yep.
So all they want laws for against drugs is to keep the prices up.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Michael, we've enjoyed this. This has been great. I think Matt and I could actually go on all day talking with you about this, but is there anything in this conversation that you feel like we haven't quite identified or touched base on, that you just kind of last word, government, Christianity, things like that? Anything that you feel like is worth stating that hasn't been said yet?
Gentlemen, I tell you what, I have just thoroughly enjoyed our time together here. And I think it's really refreshing to be able to talk with like-minded people.
Yeah.
It just really is, because I'm surrounded by idiots where I live. And, they're good people, except they don't want to know anything. They want to be entertained.
Yeah.
And I've, I believe, are you gentlemen familiar with, I'm sure you are, both of you, you're familiar with Isaiah and the remnant, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
I think, and this is my goal. This is what I want to do. And that's why I don't want my name attached to it. I don't need my name attached to it. Because what I feel my job is to put out as much of the truth from original source documents as I can. Because, folks, there is that remnant there. You guys know it. There's that remnant. And as this government becomes more and more and more oppressive, more and more and more of these people are going to wake up.
Yep.
And have either one of you gentlemen on that subject, have you read, I believe his name was Albert J. Nock? Have you read his kind of just a wonderful story? He doesn't quote scripture, but he talks scripture. He doesn't use it verbatim. But Albert J. Nock, 1930s, I believe, he did a Isaiah and the Remnant. And it's just so well done because he put it in storybook language. And I realize, when we talk about people, we have to start them out like we would in the freedom pursuit. You got to start them out in kindergarten, just like you do when you're teaching any other subject.
Yep.
And that is one of the reasons I really like Nock's work. And, when, I'm trying to think of the king Hezekiah, who was causing all of the problems at the time. And God says to Isaiah, hey, I need you to go out there and I need you to talk to the people and tell them what a horrid condition this is and straighten them out and tell them what's going on in the world. And Isaiah says, yes, Lord, I'll be glad to do that. And then God says, yeah, but they ain't going to listen.
Yep.
And that's when Isaiah says, well, and of course, gentlemen, paraphrasing, pardon me, but that's when, Isaiah says, well, God, if they're not going to listen, why am I doing this? And he said, because I have a remnant who needs to hear your words.
I'll have to look that up. I didn't know that. I did a dissertation. I also have a master's in curriculum and instruction, and he did a work called The Theory of Education in the United States, which was just really eye-opening. So a lot of my dissertation for that was based on his theory of education, which was extremely eye-opening.
I tell you, and I'm sure you gentlemen are the same way. There's so many times that I've been doing this research for 40 years that there's been some characters that I've said, I would really have enjoyed sitting down and having a conversation with that guy.
Yeah.
And Nock's one of them.
Yeah.
Because I've wondered so many times. He wrote probably the best biography of Thomas Jefferson I've ever read.
Huh.
And it was Thomas Jefferson, warts and all. I promise you, he did not leave anything out from top to bottom. Did a fantastic piece.
Wow.
And I believe that one may have been published, in the 1920s or something. I mean, it's been a long time ago. Yeah. But that is one of the things, that when I look at these characters. But, gentlemen, I hope I've answered your questions.
Yeah, it's great. So, Mike, where can people follow you, keep up with you, learn from you?
Well, every Tuesday night for 2 hours, 9 to 11 Eastern time, I have a program on the Telegram channel called Teach Me True History. And we just go into source documents, we go into writings, and we talk about, about all of the things. Tomorrow I will be doing a 2-hour program and I've been doing it for 3 years on Jim Ram's program on Jitsi. And he does, normally he's a do-it-yourself health guy, but he wanted to get into history one day of the week, and I do that. I have some podcasts where I bring out the truth about my beloved South. And my podcasts are called Whistling Dixie.
Okay.
And I do those to where I try to bring out as much documented history as possible. And, and I'm working on a website. I'm a techno dummy, as my wife says, and she has a master's degree in educational technology. She tells me every time I sit down at a computer, there's a short between the keyboard and the seat. But and she's right. I am just technologically not astute at all. But I've got a friend who's really working hard on putting together a website. Cool. To where I can post, where I would repost like your interview once it's done and put other stuff up so other people would have the advantage of seeing it. And I got to looking the other day, and I've written in the past 40 years, and including about 5 or 6 years at one of the top libertarian sites in the country. I've got something in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 articles I've written during those. And one of the things I love to do is to go back 20 years and read my own work and see how I've changed. How has history changed my perspective?
Yeah.
Good.
So, but guys, I certainly appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again sometime.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. This has been an excellent conversation. We've really enjoyed having you on. We look forward to the next time we have you on, which we'll make sure to do that. And to all of our listeners, watchers, followers, everything else, thank you for joining this. A little bit different than our normal, but it has been very eye-opening, and we certainly have valued our time for this conversation today. May the Lord bless you and keep you.